Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Cocoa and Carbon discussion that we're having today at the World Cocoa Foundation Partnership Meeting. Today we have a great session discussing with some key thought leaders in the space of supply chain linked carbon and carbon strategies for companies. My name is Andrew Nobrega. I'm the Global Programs Director for Pure Projet. And just to give you a quick introduction to the session, who we are in the first place. So Pure Projet, we are bespoke project developers that work with companies to engage in positive impact projects within their supply chains, to strengthen resilience within those supply chains, improve livelihoods with local producers, and regenerate local ecosystems. And we do this across a number of different interventions, agroforestry and reforestation being ones that are particularly relevant to the community of actors today. And we do this on a global basis with partners and brands, many of you which are friends in the room today. So we're very excited to be here today to speak about the concept of how companies that are making commitments to science-based targets, net zero, and similar initiatives to foster a conversation on how we can align and find synergies between different actions all seeking to drive impact at the field level, specifically and largely in line with the Cocoa and Forest Initiative and all of the actions that the cocoa industry has been taking in line with that. So we're going to talk about a couple of different focus areas with regards to sustainability. And the opportunity that we have today is to discuss with a number of key thought leaders on how we can consolidate and learn from these different activities, but also consolidate accounting principles, understand how different initiatives at the field level can be understood and associated with different carbon accounting standards, different carbon frameworks, and different carbon commitments. And so just to list, obviously addressing deforestation has been a key and primary driver within the cocoa space with the World Cocoa Foundation under the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. At the same time, globally, we've seen increasing commitments on carbon in the private sector, led initially through the presence and availability of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but most recently, at the same time as the Paris Agreements, the development of the Science-Based Target Initiative, which really drove and gave key frameworks for the private sector to engage in ambitious targets to address their 2% or more ambitious 1.5 degree targets for carbon. And more recently, with additional information, we've had the net zero initiatives that have been evolving to be complementary to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and to allow for a more diversified portfolio of actions that can supplement the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has been fairly focused on reductions, with other available portfolios of actions. We've seen a natural progression of companies seeking to address carbon and other impacts with closer proximity to their supply chains. So over the last number of years, we've seen a natural tendency of prioritization from what has traditionally been an offsetting space to what is a supply chain intervention or an insetting space. And through the actions that many actors in the cocoa space have been doing with regards to reforestation, forest conservation, cocoa producing landscapes, these projects are more proximate to what they may have been participating with offsetting projects on a global basis previously. And finally, we have multi-stakeholder interactions where we have the private sector engaging on addressing deforestation at the same time as countries and national governments determining their own fates in terms of how they want to address carbon within their own boundaries. So we have the private sector with their targets regarding Science-Based Target Initiative with regards to reductions in their supply chains, net zero initiatives with regards to opportunities to restore and regenerate landscapes, deforestation-free commitments across the industry to address the impacts that the cocoa industry has had over time. And then all of this is couched and in the context of national strategies that are strongly influencing how those investments can be valued by companies, whether that's in addressing the rights of farmers and community members to land tenure, tree tenure, and the rights to ecosystem services and assets, whether that's with regard to forest and natural resource policies at national levels, protected area policies, and then obviously the RED strategies, international and partnerships and investments that different companies are making with regards to carbon within their boundaries, and benefit sharing policies. So really, we have a great team today to discuss a couple of key questions that we find generally arise in the context of saying how, when we are addressing landscape restoration and conservation, can we link this and find synergies with carbon actions that we want to take as a company? And how do we have those conversations understand the context that's happening at the international level and at the national level that may influence those decisions? So we have a couple of key questions. How do these various global initiatives overlap? Where are the synergies between them, between deforestation strategies, carbon strategies, and national policies? To what degree can supply chain linked actions be monitored and leveraged to support cocoa industry's push forward towards I had the video in front of me, science-based targets, net zero commitments, and similar initiatives? What main obstacles does the private sector face in implementing and valuing these emission reduction projects and strategies? How do we incentivize all actors to participate in restoring forest ecosystems while avoiding potential issues of double counting and supporting equitable benefit sharing? And finally, how are the dynamics and frameworks surrounding monitoring and evaluation, carbon markets, and certification systems evolving, considering the growth of insetting, supply chain linked carbon actions, and contemporary corporate GHG commitment frameworks? So today, as I said, we have a wonderful group of speakers who can each bring from their own experiences, their own knowledge, key comments and key advice on these topics. First, we're going to hear from Cynthia Kumis, the Director of Private Sector Climate Action at the WRI World Resources Institute's Business Center. Cynthia is the Director of Private Sector Climate Change and formerly the Deputy Director of the GHG Protocol. And so specifically led the development of the corporate scope 3 and value change accounting principles for the WRI, and particularly led the charge with regards to the development of the science-based target initiative. So wonderful to have Cynthia here today to speak about the WRI's work and how that's influenced, defined some of the principles of the different reporting schemes that the WRI has been promoting, and share with us her thoughts. Then we have Francesca Sinner, the Senior Director of Corporate Sustainability Advisory at South Pole. As many of you know, South Pole is one of the key advisories globally, working with the private sector and public sector to define strategies to address climate change on a global basis, whether that's within supply chains, whether that's across corporate commitments. We have Alexander Van Mayo, the Global Head of Confectionery and Ice Cream at Nestle. And he has been leading since 2008 the drive of Nestle across sustainability strategies, and particularly has some very relevant experiences, both in terms of the field implementation of restoration activities and how that translates into Nestle's own strategies for net zero, SBTs, etc. We have Charlotte Streck, the co-founder and managing partner of Climate Focus, with vast experience across the landscape of addressing the legal and technical concepts within carbon markets. Charlotte has been leading the Climate Focus as an advisory, working with governments and companies on a global basis to help define structures that promote impact across the board and are enabling environments for action. And finally, not last but not least, we have Naomi Swickard, who is the Chief Program Officer at Vera and has been a key leader across Vera's portfolios addressing nature-based solutions, including RED, including AFALU projects, and particularly has been focused on the Landscale program, new initiatives to look at outcome-based initiatives at the landscape level, agricultural landscape level. Finally, Andrew Nobrega, as I said, Director of Global Programs at Pure Projet. And with that, I'd love to hand over to Cynthia to take the lead, present her thoughts on this topic, and we'll see you soon as we get into the question period after that. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thanks, Andrew. I think you need to stop sharing your screen so I can share mine. Okay, hold on. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the Science-Based Targets Initiative, in particular about our net zero standard that we launched a couple weeks ago, which I think will provide a good framing for the discussion today. If you're not familiar with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, it was launched in 2015 with the aim of raising the ambition of greenhouse gas emission reduction targets by corporations and make them in line with science. And with the hope to make them standard practice. As time has gone on, we're now evolving more into a standard setting body for science-based target setting. This is continually out of date, but just to give you a brief update on our progress, it continues. The momentum just kind of been snowballing since 2015, and we're now getting about 50 companies joining per week. And we have about 2,100 companies with commitments to set science-based targets, and half of them have had their targets already validated by the initiative. And more than half of those companies also have committed to targets in line with 1.5 degrees, so the highest level of ambition. As of next July, we'll only be allowing 1.5 degree targets. So 2 weeks ago, we launched a standard that's been under development for the last couple of years to define net zero standards for net zero target setting for corporates. That we've been defining this net zero as this end state where there's this balance of of emissions and removals where there's no additional impact on the climate. And this assumes that companies are decarbonizing in line with 1.5 degrees and getting down to the point where they only have residual emissions that are expected at 2050 and are balancing those residual emissions with permanent removals. We saw there was a need for this standard just because of the whole range of targets that were out there around climate neutral, climate positive, carbon neutral, carbon negative, and they were different in all these different dimensions that you see on this slide. And so we just wanted to provide clarity to the marketplace as we saw this growing momentum, especially around net zero target setting. So there's like 4 key components of a net zero target within the science-based targets net zero standard. So the first thing is that companies have to set a near-term science-based target. So we've kind of relabeled SBTs. They are really near-term SBTs. These are 5 to 10 year targets that get companies on the trajectory, the 1.5 degree trajectory to get them to this endpoint of net zero by 2050 or sooner. So all companies that want to say they have net zero targets have to also have a validated near-term science-based target. The next step is to have this long-term science-based target. We've decided at this point really just to focus on the abatement piece. That's the most critical piece and what companies should be prioritizing. So that's what we're currently validating are these long-term abatement targets. And these targets require most companies to reduce emissions at a minimum of 90%. So we've been saying it's like less net and more zero, that there's just not that much room for removals, and this net zero really needs to be about abatement. And then in the transition to net zero, we want to encourage companies to invest in the transition, to accelerate the transition by making investments outside of their value chain. This could be through offsets, it could be through other mechanisms. Offsets are not allowed to meet a science-based target, a near-term or a long-term science-based target, but we still want to encourage investments in nature-based solutions and other things outside the value chain. For like cocoa companies in the food value chain, there are opportunities to actually drive removals within the value chain as well. So next year we'll be providing more guidance or we're scoping right now, and we'll determine next year what we want to do around beyond value chain mitigation to incentivize that kind of action. But right now, this is a should, so it's an optional component of the net zero framework. And then the fourth piece is what I mentioned before, is just that when you get to this full abatement down to residual emissions expected by 2050, then there's you neutralize those residual emissions with permanent removals. And next year we'll also be providing more guidance about what best practices are in investments in these removals. So this just maps out like how near-term targets and long-term targets are similar and differ. So on the boundary for like scope 3, this is where there is a change, right? So in the near term, we want companies to have a more manageable approach to get a handle on scope 3. And so we've only required scope 3 targets for companies that have large scope 3 emissions. For companies in the food value chain, these emissions are generally always large. So all food companies in the SBTI have scope 3 targets. But what's different now is for the long-term targets, the boundary is going to be larger, and you have to cover, so all companies will have to set scope 3 targets, and the boundary, it will increase from 67% of scope 3 emissions to 90%. So the ambition is really being raised here. All targets for these long-term targets have to be aligned with 1.5. For near-term targets, scope 3 only have to be well below 2-degree aligned. And obviously the time frame is different. And then we have a whole range of methods that can be used for near-term and long-term SBTs. They're generally the same. The supplier engagement target setting approach we allow for near-term targets won't be allowed for long-term targets. And we'll start we have started validating these targets, but we'll have a more formalized official process starting in January. But you can now we now have like a reservation system, like a booking system that you can get into now to reserve a target validation. So just one more thing I want to quickly mention, or two more things, is GHG protocol, if you're not aware, are in the middle of a review, a development process for land sector. For land sector accounting, so provide much more clarity around how to account for CO2 removals and biogenic emissions, land use change, and there'll be new requirements in these standards that will then be considered for revisions within the Science-Based Targets Initiative as well. And there'll be guidance and requirements around setting removal target, or doing a removals of inventory separate from an emissions inventory. The draft is finished. It's going in through internal review now. Will be available for external review and for road testing very soon. I think there's already 100 companies set up for the road testing. And then in parallel, SBTI has been developing a new target setting method specifically for companies in the land sector. There's going to be two methods, one for companies that are have diversified emissions. So for like food processors, restaurant chains, to set land sector targets that include land use change, which currently isn't covered in the SBTI. And it will require a removal target and an emissions target. And then there's also a separate approach for companies that have that are just more homogeneous and have just focus on like one or a few commodities. And so these are just a list of the pathways and target setting methods that are created for various commodities. I think it was explored to develop a pathway specifically for the cocoa sector, but it was determined too difficult for various technical reasons. But I can get you more information about that for those who are interested. And I'll leave it with that and turn it over to Anne for the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And thanks, Andrew, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Yeah, great overview, Cynthia. Thanks. I guess I will, first of all, let me thank you. I'm honored to be in this panel. It's great to speak with among all these experts, and I hope we all learn from each other. I guess what you described, Cynthia, from a more technical point of view, I'm supposed to speak about how this translates into the practice, what we see out there with corporates who try to implement what exactly you described, and what are the trends, what are the challenges, and especially what are the implications to the cocoa sector. So now I can't move the slides, so sorry. I knew that I would have technical issues. Do you see the screen?
We can see the screen, but perhaps you want to take it out of full screen.
Here we go.
Oh, there you go. It's gone. There you go.
Awesome. So to repeat what Cynthia said in very technical terms, and I'm saying it very simple, but sometimes that helps. And the combination of it makes it remember. Net zero, what does it mean? In 3 very simple steps said, you first of all measure your footprint in all its complexities, scope 1, 2, and 3. So the entire value chain. You, in a second step, as Cynthia said, you abate or you reduce, you decarbonize as much as you can. All levels, all scopes. And then in a third step, whatever you cannot reduce, the residual part of emissions, you balance off with high quality removals. That sounds pretty easy, very simple, not as simple, not as static, should be seen as a continuous process. I try to lay it out here. That's a little bit closer to Cynthia's graph. It gives the time component in it and the dynamic. So just to translate the simple steps into a little bit more abstract words, see the green dotted, the gray dotted line. It's the potential business as usual carbon emissions of an organization or an activity. First step was you reduce, you decarbonize. That's the dark blue area. So as Cynthia said, 90%, I think it's more than 90% in your new rules. For most of the sectors, agricultural sectors are 80%. I'm not sure if it's completely confirmed. We can debate later, but it's between 80 and 90% what you are required to decarbonize. And then you start over time to also invest into removals, to neutralize at the end your residual emissions. Here in this picture, you see that the net zero stage has reached in 2040. That depends on what target year you have. However, the journey is not ended there. It continues. And how it continues, as Cynthia said, I mean, there is climate positive, there is climate negative terms, people aim for something different. I think if the net zero goal is achieved, whatever can be done on top of that is great. We supportive, whatever investment flows into activities to either decarbonize, to neutralize, great. People should do that, but just to emphasize what the net zero is not the end goal here. How to operationalize that once you have your theoretical plan and you have this in kind of a timeline and you have your targets and know when you want to reach what. Again, simple steps here, very, very simplified. What we see and what we work with the most of our clients with is doing that measurement, understanding your impact, measure your scope 1, 2, 3 footprint, and really go down to primary level data. So it has some complexity with it, but I think that basis is necessary and a good starting point. Then you set your ambitions, you define your timeline, you set your targets, and then you try to understand, okay, what are your options to decarbonize? What are the interventions you might already do? Think about what you're doing, how can you scale it over your business, but also thinking of new potential measures to decarbonize as well as to remove carbon. And then you develop your prioritized roadmap. So what actions do you want to do first? Not taking all the low-hanging fruits in the beginning, but maybe mix it, do a diversified portfolio and invest early into removals because the market gets tight. And then yes, you try to mix measures as well, something you know well, with maybe pilot testing, trying something new, maybe being the first, and mix these activities. And at the end, ensure that you monitor well, that you measure and do your footprinting on a regular basis, that you reconvene, that you continue on your roadmap as planned. And I think it doesn't sound like rocket science. It's getting more complex in reality, but also saying that nobody has done that yet perfectly to the end. We all in testing modes here, and we all trying and learning on the way. So it also requires a lot of collaboration. So what does this mean for cocoa and the cocoa sector? I mean, same steps, right? So what needs to be done? Measure the footprint, get aware of your impact, then commit to the science-based targets and reduce in line with science 80% for the cocoa sector. Roughly said, I made a short investigation. So I think you could roughly say the cocoa sector has a footprint of 100 million tons. That's based on a rough study. I can give details later, but if you imagine 100 million tons today, you would need to reduce by 50% every 10 years. So in 2030, want to have reduced it by half, so 50 million tons. In 2040, you want to be at 25 tons. And in 2050, you want to be at 12.5, something like this. So it's a lot. It's a big effort. And then at the same time, the remainder you need to neutralize or invest into removals. Concretely said, what is your options for interventions? We distinguish on-farm and off-farm interventions. I think, Andrew, you pointed at it a little bit already. First option you have is directly invest into activities on your cocoa farms. These could be soil management, on-farm deforestation activities, that could be yield improvements, all kind of measures. And these ones would account for your SPTs. So you could account for them under your SPT. They are closed in your direct value chain, so to say, what Cynthia described. Then second option is going a little bit broader, off-farm into the community, doing interventions such as forest conservation, etc. Community-based projects could be with the cocoa farm families, households, cook stoves, water filters, and those ones could not be claimed for your SPT, most of it, depending a little bit on the rules, but I think, Cynthia, in general, we could say those are more going into the offset market, so you can use those credits for compensation, but not directly for your SPT claims. And then last but not least, there is the landscape lens of activities, and we have been seeing lately trends of national carbon programs. Andrew highlighted those as well, associated to benefit sharing schemes. For example, the Ghana and the Ivory Coast RED Plus programs, they provide certain performance-based incentives through their benefit sharing schemes to on and off farm projects. And they really look at the landscape, they put the landscape into a certain jurisdiction, and they want to bring in a more holistic view and also think beyond carbon, so cover other impacts such as biodiversity, such as water. That said, those options are not only necessary for fulfilling a net zero commitment, or they're not the end in itself, they also should generate value for the communities, generate value for the farmers, generate value for whoever is financing it in terms of using certain claims, getting better investor relationships, ratings, etc. This is actually the same kind of idea and picture as the one before. It shows again the 3 types of projects, but I like that picture and I wanted to highlight one thing. So this should be familiar to you. It's at the cocoa plantation area. You all know it. What I want would like to emphasize on is that landscape level. It is really important to understand those things are not black and white. They cannot be really separated that easily. And it's not always clear where the boundaries are. So everything is connected, and that connection adds value. So let's leverage that connection. So when you think landscape, the different impacts play a role, and you can get much more value than only thinking on farm, one little piece of land. So let's remember that. That's what I wanted to show on this slide, bringing me to the trends and the challenges we see out there in the market. On the trends, I mean, there is clear commitments to net zero. They're coming there daily. You see it. Not everyone clearly has an idea of how to get there, but at least the commitments and the targets are out there. That's positive. There is a lot of pressure from consumers. There is pressure from investors. There's climate risks get obvious, and action is required in terms of mitigation as well as adaptation. So we see action or willingness to act in the corporate sector, as well as on the country level. A lot of countries commit to policies, programs, etc. And navigating in that complexity sometimes slows us all down. And we see a focus of corporates into the on-farm level to be able to claim things under SBTs. However, we really want to emphasize that we need to focus on the landscape level. And that brings me to the challenges. How do we scale fast enough, right? And that's there the landscape idea comes in. I mean, small climate smart farming activities, there is a certain potential to scale that. But on the landscape level, we can scale. And what we need to ensure while thinking there is whatever activities we're fostering, we need to ensure that everyone in the value chain benefits. So not only the ones providing finance, but going down to the farm level. We need to have more certainty in the frameworks, in the accountability, regulatory frameworks, what Cynthia described. Whenever there is, flag is coming out in half a year, everyone is waiting for it, and it slows down is a little bit down. I know that Cynthia and the whole WRI are doing a great job, but that's needed. We need clarity, otherwise we slow. We need the landscape focus, we need the beyond carbon focus, we need additional finance, and not only the traditional carbon finance, but thinking climate and nature. So thinking other impacts, ecosystem services. It opens up completely new financing sources. And we need to ensure proper monitoring systems, agreed upon monitoring systems and KPIs for that, right? In the CFI, in the national cocoa platforms, we need to put it down so that we all agree on this is where we're going. And to narrow down the financing point, so climate and nature finance, there is a lot of activities out there, and I can name a couple of examples shortly, but generally, again, we need to agree upon how we measure and how we set targets for it together. Climate and nature finance will add additional co-financing benefits, as well as ensuring that everyone in the value chain benefits. So if we think landscape, we usually ensure that on-farm and off-farm and farm level farmers benefit, as well as higher level stakeholders. So I think, yeah, we really need to open up a little bit our lens of thinking and our perspectives. And sure, let me finish the sentence and then I'll hand over to Alexander. So South Pole is has examples of all these different kind of projects. We're trying to implement other financial mechanisms such as impact funds, etc. And I'm happy to discuss. And I'm excited to hand over to Alexander now, because he has some very concrete examples. We'll learn from it what are the challenges. And Alexander, please take it from here.
Thanks, Anne. And I think I first have to share my screen once you stop.
Yeah, I have to stop. Exactly. Let me find my mouse.
So this is a warning. I'm not a specialist, all of you. So share. So can you please confirm if you see?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Yeah. So good evening, everyone. It's also for me, it's an honor to be part of this group to participate on this panel. So I'm not a specialist. I'm a business person and trying with my team to sell and indulge people around the world with chocolate. But of course, we are as a big player. Of course, we and as part of Nestle. And why is so now it's moving. Nestle has signed the 1.5 decree. And we have a net zero roadmap, and it's quite in line with what Anne and Cynthia have explained. We have more concrete actions short term, and ideas that we have to accelerate in the long term. But let's say to tackle a problem, we first have to, of course, to name it. We called our whole thing, we called it the path to regeneration for future generations, and this is a bit in the line with what Anne also explained. And our problem, which we try to define, is the baseline, which is 92 million tons. So it's massive. Yeah? So Anu said it's 100 million tons is the total cocoa industry. We as Nestle, total Nestle, we talk about 92 million tons, which of course is a massive amount of gas. Confectionery is only 8 million tons, so 9% of that. So what have we done so short term to accelerate? We have committed 3 billion Swiss francs of spending over the next 4 or 5 years to really focus on manufacturing, on changing dramatically sometimes our packaging, cutting down on virgin plastic, moving we have more than 400 factories in the world across all categories to renewable energy. So really doing quite a lot of steps. We then have to further scale up. We don't have the solutions for everything. We need to change ingredients, move more to plant-based. And the presentation now will more focus to what can we do really in cocoa. And here we talk more about, let's say, forest positive strategy. And why do we believe about forest positive? Because we say, yes, one thing is protection, but protection is not enough. We really have to move into a forest positive, because we believe on one side, this will help or contribute to have thriving communities. It will promote more sustainable livelihoods, and it has also to do with respecting human rights. How can we monitor this? It's a lot about innovations, technology, and of course, we are very grateful to have satellite services, which really help us to get a clear idea of where do we stand. In our total supply chain as Nestle, we have 100%, or we will be at 100% deforestation free next year for quite some ingredients already, like palm oil, like soy, like sugar, like pulp, meat. Not yet for cocoa. Unfortunately, cocoa and coffee will be 25. Yeah, but we are on a good way. And forest positive, and this was also mentioned before. This is not something I'm sitting here in Geneva in Switzerland at the lake. I have a nice view to the lake. This is not done from here. It only works if you really work hand in hand with farmers, with local communities, with industry partners, and of course with the governments. And we define for us this forest positive. We define this in principle in a 3-step approach. The first is probably the easiest, we could say, and this is along with others and within the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, is just simply mapping where do we stand, yeah, and to ensure that we source or that our cocoa comes from areas which are outside of the protected areas and deforestation free at least since 2015. And then we supply forest and fruit trees to cocoa farmers to encourage and to ensure this agroforestry. And so far we have supplied over 2 million trees over the last year, so it's quite a number. And finally, we work on this landscape level with forest preservation and restoration. And here I have 3 projects just to name out, and in the first one I will go a bit more into detail. The first one is the Cavalli Forest. This is on the western side of the Ivory Coast, and here we work in the partnership with Earthworm and the government, and I will come later to that one. The second is Bosmati in the Becky Forest landscape, where we do work with Rainforest Alliance and 3 cooperatives, and this is really a project where we encourage agroforestry around the forest, yeah, and forest restoration inside the forest with these 3 local communities. And the last is, it's also interesting because it's very different. It's with the local community forest at Trois-Zéro. This is the pronunciation I was told. This is a pilot with a small community to support the preservation of their local sacred forest. It's only 10 hectares. So in principle, it's very small, but it is very important to the local community and has a lot to do also with the commitment. And it's only the combination of small, medium, and big projects which will really bring us to different levels. So if we zoom into this Cavalli forest, it always starts with, with a community consultation. Yeah, we need to understand what is really important for them, what is their people's attitudes and the issues, because only if we work together with them, there is any chance that the projects would succeed. And then it covers preserve, of course, preserve what is left, yeah, to ensure that there is no further deforestation, but then also to restore what has been degraded. We all know, unfortunately, it has happened. And then, but also showing this pathway, these transitions for those who depend today on the forest, who had an income in doing the deforestation, which then finally should lead to this improving livelihoods and promoting a regenerative agriculture, which is there also for the generations to come. The Cavalli forest is a big one. Yeah? It's 67,000 hectares, so it is very sizable. And if you look at what have we been able to achieve so far, it is remarkable, I would say. Yeah, it's not yet enough, but you can see on the right side, the loss of forest has decreased significantly. It's close to zero. It's not yet enough. Yeah? And I explained before, we have to stop it and to restore. Yeah? But we are nearly there at stopping it. And on the left side, you see an example how it works with the satellite monitoring. We get the warning from Starling, which is our partner there, and the red dots, the small red dots, these are warnings. Yeah, where we then can focus, where we can go to the local communities and with the community patrols to really see, okay, what is going on there. Yeah. Then we have to restore. Yeah. So for example, this year in the Cavalli forest, we have replanted 366 hectares. This is 75,000 seedlings which had to be planted. And here you see a nursery for the forest trees and the local community, where we really engage with them to make this happen. And you see on the right side, you see these parts of the Cavalli forest where this restoring has happened. And finally, what is really important is this, and Anne has mentioned that before, it only makes sense if everyone has something of that. Yeah? It's not just for the industry to feel good. And we need to improve these livelihoods. And there we are working with the farmers around the Cavalli forest, yeah, in order to give them a reason not anymore to take trees from there, which they believe is anyhow is part of their own area. And so we do actions like promoting good practices by setting up demonstration plans to really learn and show them together. Look, in other areas it works like this. You don't need more size. Yeah, you just need to apply better practices. Setting up pruning groups, which is an activity which is heavy work, which is also a bit dangerous. So you need adults trained who help really to prune the trees, and also encouraging this agroforestry with this distribution of the forest and fruit trees, which also generate alternative income. So as a summary, yes, we have a net zero commitment, we have a positive forest commitment, many actions, but still many more to learn. Yeah, so there, and then we work together with our partners to improve there. We have several projects in place to preserve, to restore, with different partners at different scales. We will add more projects, but the most crucial is really, this only works if you really work very close with the local communities and the local governments, because otherwise we will not have any impact on the ground. Thank you. And now I hand over to Charlotte from Climate Focus.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. And now I share my screen. Let me see. Do you see my screen now? Oh yeah, of course. It always comes with a bit of a delay, but it is coming. And now I swap.
There you go. We can see it now. That's perfect.
Okay, very good.
Apologies. It swapped displays. If you could just click swap delay, then it will be perfect.
Okay, so very good. So my job is now here, take you from the field and from the trees to talk a bit more about the abstract part of the engagement, in particular the role of governments, and then I've been asked to say something about carbon rights and about accounting. So a lot of things that in themselves are complicated. So I can only in the 6 minutes and something that are left here, I can only scratch them. But it should be enough to give you an idea of the interface between the governments and corporate activities, in particular as they relate to carbon markets, activities that involve the accounting of carbon, whatever is done with the resulting carbon credits. So first, 2 slides that summarize a number of high-level findings from the Vcm Global Dialogue, an activity that we implemented with the support of Vera, and that looked in particular at the role, the expectations, and the opportunity of carbon markets from the perspective of the supplier. So we are now not looking at the buyers or the users of carbon credit, but the governments. And here, it is we see that the growing demand for carbon credits by corporates like Nestle and others provides an opportunity for governments to channel significant additional funds into climate mitigation, to achieve and go beyond their nationally determined contribution. The carbon markets provide in particular also opportunities to access foreign direct investments and in hard currency. In doing so and in using carbon markets, it's always important to stress that these markets complement and do not replace public policy. Similarly, as I do not replace corporate decarbonization, they should also not displace government activities. But they are a nice complement, and they are also in the nature of what they offer and in the way how they direct finance to emission reductions complementary. What is important for governments and corporates to maximize the benefits of the voluntary carbon market is a strategic engagement. First and foremost, both sides, the project developer, carbon markets, and governments should know of each other. They should get to know each other. There is a good number, or some reluctance and lack of mistrust is maybe a bit too much, but reluctance to engage because governments often don't know what's going on in their country, and in order to proactively support corporates and or voluntary carbon market investment, first step is to know each other, to know what's going on in the countries, to understand what are the conditions for investment, and then establish a strategy on how and where to channel investments in the landscape in the countries, and that can result into public-private cooperation. Now, one issue is, and that's relevant, for also the programs that my pre-speakers mentioned, whether they are on the landscape scale or on the project scale. It is important to keep in mind that there are entities, communities, farmers, national parks, a mix of public and private use and ownership to the landscape that determines also the rights of carbon. So it is important that those that are holding rights, formal or informal, rights to the landscape or forest resources, participate in the programs. That can be by developing their own projects or by being part of a benefit sharing mechanisms, but it should be self-determined, because these carbon rights, of course, are an essential, or respecting carbon rights is also essential, an element of a rights-based approach towards these investments. This is particularly important, and that is applicable to many of the landscapes that we talk here about, is where there are contested titles, contested or weak land titles. It's important to engage with the communities. It's important to engage with the farmers. Again, whether they hold formal land titles or not, they claim the land and they need to be part of the program. And where it is not legally clear who holds the carbon rights, this should be clarified on a basis of contracts. We have public and private actors investing. We have increasingly government sponsored larger landscape project in the context of RED or larger agricultural sectoral program, and they should be synergistic with investments of private companies on the development of private projects, as such as what Anne described before. It is, there should be no either or. These activities are complementary. It is also a reflection of the different carbon rights and the different preferences on how to use the landscape and access carbon markets. But this leads to accounting challenges which can be resolved through so-called nested implementation models that that reflect, the different accounting levels and align them. This, can look at the end. We have not only a landscape of different carbon, a landscape of different activities, but that results in a landscape of different accounting levels and programs that could be jurisdictional emission reduction programs, private, RED projects, or now also Article 6 pilots, or, hopefully very soon, Article 6 activities. Then this is my last slide, of course, the credible use of carbon credits is important. We have now guidance, based on coming out of Glasgow on when and how projects can fall under Article 6. In this case, they need to be authorized then by the governments and backed by corresponding adjustments. Most likely we will have both. We will have projects without corresponding adjustments and with corresponding adjustments. Both activities and both have a role to play. So we will expect, I expect to shift a lot of the discussions from the implementation mode and the activities on the ground also to the question on credible claims by governments and hence the credible use of carbon credits. Thank you very much. And now, last but not least, and I realize that this was a lot in 7 minutes, but it gives you a very rough idea what is all going on in the exciting world of carbon markets. And here now, Naomi will continue and take it from there.
Thank you, Charlotte. Definitely a lot to build on there, as well as the other speakers. So thanks again for the opportunity. I'll just start with a really quick overview of who we are at Verra, and then go into a bit of reflecting on sort of carbon markets, net zero versus carbon neutrality, and the link that all that has with sustainability and efforts in the cocoa space. So to start out with, Verra, for any of you that don't know, we are a nonprofit standards organization. We develop and manage standards that drive sustainability impacts, particularly in terms of climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a number of different relevant standards and frameworks. I think the three that I'm mostly going to mention today are Landscale, SD Vista, and the VCS. So Landscale is a partnership with Rainforest Alliance and Conservation International. And that framework really focuses on measuring, reporting, and making claims related to landscape-wide sustainability, especially in productive landscapes. And I think many of you on the call have actually been involved in that in one way or another. The second is SD Vista, or the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard. So similarly to Landscale, that's about looking at sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals, but at a project scale instead of a landscape scale. And then finally, the VCS, the most relevant in terms of carbon, which is the leading standard for voluntary carbon markets. It's also increasingly being used in compliance situations domestically and internationally. And the VCS accounts for about 85% of voluntary carbon market transactions, according to the latest Ecosystem Marketplace report. So I want to focus on three main things today. One, coming out of the UNFCCC COP26 last week, sort of what's the latest in terms of carbon market opportunities and how does that relate to net zero and carbon neutrality. And then talk a little bit about the link between that and sustainability. And finally, how do we sort of combine these things and look for the win-wins between sustainability and carbon, and how does that play out in the cocoa sector? So in terms of carbon markets, I think Charlotte has provided a good overview of some of the latest. So, and there's so much we could talk about there. I think I'll just focus a little bit on kind of the exciting outcome that we see from COP26, as well as sort of the link between net zero and some of what we heard earlier from science-based targets and what's more happening in carbon offset markets and carbon neutrality plans. So to start with, I just want to focus on two concepts. I think we've heard already quite a bit in terms of what science-based targets is about and what net zero is about. That piece is super important. It's about setting a pathway to decarbonize. It's about having an established pathway for internal reductions. And it's a key starting point in terms of overall corporate commitments and transparency around how we're not just going to address emissions today, but how we're actually going to decarbonize along, over time until we get to a point that people are at net zero. But in complement to that, there is a whole nother space, and I think this is what really sits behind the huge growth in carbon markets over the last few years, is more related to carbon neutrality. It's about a compensation for the footprint that all of us and all of these companies have today, that is really a recognition of the unavoidable emissions that are present today in the supply chains of these companies, and that remain relevant until we can actually get to that net zero target. And so the key role that carbon markets play and the key role that offsets play within that is really providing a means to compensate for those unavoidable emissions. And it's really important that we don't look at this as an either or. They are tools that both need to be used in order to address the emissions that we have today, move finance as quickly as possible to emission reductions today, while also driving towards this long-term transitional goal. Within that, I would also just make one other point, which is that emission removals are obviously really important to the long-term solution, but emission reductions are equally important, especially today. As you all know, and as many of you are working on in terms of reducing deforestation, protecting standing forests is absolutely critical, both in terms of where we're at on climate and addressing climate change and preventing further climate impacts. And so through carbon markets, we can really drive today a lot of investment into reductions and into protecting standing forests while we're working on this longer term transition and towards producing a lot more removals that are needed for the long term. So focusing just briefly then, or shifting perhaps to COP26, as many of you will have heard, the carbon markets article, Article 6, was agreed. That's super exciting. It's been a number of years that that's been in process. And we now have clear rules for country-to-country trades under Article 6.2, for project-level trades and a successor to the CDM, which can also be used by countries and regulated companies within them to meet NDC targets under Article 6.4. There's a lot of questions circulating right now what that means for voluntary markets, and I think it's important to articulate that those rules under Article 6 do not regulate voluntary carbon markets. That said, there are, I think, going to be a lot of shifting work over the next year on what kinds of claims can be made. So it's possible potentially for some countries to be able to grant what's called a corresponding adjustment. In other words, making sure that, or sort of recognizing that a unit's been exported by a country and authorized by a country. It's possible to apply those in voluntary markets, but not required. But that said, where a company wants to use those that don't have it, I think this next year is going to see, especially under the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or VCMI, an evolution in the kinds of claims that can be made. So claims might shift in terms of whether or not a unit does have that corresponding adjustment, whether or not the company has set or not set a net zero target, whether or not the company is making progress along the way towards that target. So a lot happening still in terms of articulating those claims. And I think that's something that everyone should be aware of, particularly in terms of Article 6 outcomes and then what's coming up. With short time, I just want to touch a little bit then on the carbon and sustainability link. Many of you, I think, are working probably on setting net zero and science-based targets, working on a range of sustainability initiatives within the cocoa sector that might touch on things like reforestation, revegetation, agroforestry, avoiding deforestation. All of these obviously have a link between carbon and sustainable development and sustainability. And I think it's important to highlight, as this has sort of come up, but maybe less directly in the last few speakers, that the strategies to address sustainability can be maximized, and improving on sustainable development and sustainable development goal outcomes and carbon impacts at the same time can drive towards overall more holistic landscapes. And so, obviously there are trade-offs. At times there's never always a win-win, but a lot of the activities that improve on sustainability also improve on carbon. And so looking at these as a package is something that is both important, but also a real opportunity, I think, for companies looking to address Scope 3 emissions at the same time as making good on things around any other sustainability issue, whether that's biodiversity or water quality or labor issues, for example. So just very briefly, at Verra, how do we look at these things, and how could you potentially combine some of these efforts to really drive outcomes across a whole portfolio of sustainability issues? I just want to mention a few quick things there. So we have a number of different tools and standards that can be leveraged at the project level. We've talked about VCS and the opportunity to develop projects there. We also have the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard that really is about being able to assess sustainability outcomes at a quantified level for any SDG. So if you're implementing activities on farm that work on labor issues or diversified incomes or other livelihoods issues, or resiliency, those things can be quantified and measured with the SD Vista framework. Many of those activities also produce emission reductions. So you can actually produce a VCU, in other words, a carbon unit that is labeled with these outcomes for the Sustainable Development Goals. That's another way to sort of maximize a way to identify and finance and implement and report on these outcomes. There's also a link between the project and the landscape level. I think this has come up a few times in the last few speakers talking about this link to landscape-wide sustainability. As I mentioned, Landscale is a new framework. It's in beta testing launch right now. Its final launch is in February of next year. We have 20 or more pilot activities going on around the world, many of which I think probably those of you in the audience are participating in. And that is really about being able to measure and monitor landscape-wide sustainability on all these kinds of issues that can actually address these sort of holistic and issues, the trade-offs between things, and identify where there are gaps that need investment. There's also the possibility to link then anything that a corporate or a particular company might be doing in that landscape to the overall landscape outcomes. So Landscale allows you to actually look at the contribution that a single company is making to those landscape outcomes, and it can even be tied to project level VCS activities. So a VCS project that is contributing to landscape level sustainability outcomes by not just avoiding deforestation, but also looking at addressing water quality issues as an example, or biodiversity, and contributes to those outcomes at a landscape level, can actually validate those claims around the contribution that activity is having. So there's opportunities there to kind of really link those two. And then finally, I'll just end on a supply chain focus. Obviously, these are things that happen in a particular place, whether we're talking about a project or a landscape level, and yet for many of you working on the corporate side, you're looking at a whole supply chain that might be sourcing from many, many different places. That becomes difficult when we need to shift from project level implementation to Scope 3 accounting. And so one of the other things that Verra is working on now is looking at how we can link a lot of the traceability initiatives to the activities on the ground and sort of shift from project level place-based accounting into supply chain accounting, and be able to look at things from an emission factor per unit of output perspective, for example, as well as how things essentially then would shift from an offset to an inset or within Scope 3. So there's a lot happening there as well. And that might apply not only for carbon, but also for some of these sustainability and SDG outcomes that these sorts of activities have and that are relevant within the Scope 3 emissions and sort of broader impacts that companies have. So if anybody has questions on those, happy to take them or happy to take it offline. But I think overall, the point I'm trying to make here is just that by considering these interactions up front, it's possible to drive forward commitments on multiple issues together and really look for ways to improve the efficiency, reduce costs, and maximize impact of initiatives that are focused on both sustainability and carbon. Thank you.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, everyone. I am finishing off there. I mean, if you haven't learned something the last hour, you're a genius on this topic, because there was so much depth in the different topics that were delved into there. So first of all, you know, going into the details of the WRI, where sustainability frameworks are for companies and what they were seeking to report against, with Francesca walking us through how we can think about plotting a course and a strategy towards those net zero and SBT goals in light of supply chain interventions. Alexander sharing key case example of how a company has taken that drive and moved forward with it, making in-field investments and tying that directly to their own overarching principles. Charlotte delving into the nuances and details of the legal frameworks and ecosystems that we are addressing at the country level with regards to tenure, rights to assets, and how that translates into different frameworks that corporates need to consider when they're making these investments. And then finally with Naomi delving into the carbon markets, but also strongly into the evolution of how certification bodies are adapting to the evolving circumstances of companies getting more involved at the supply chain level and seeking to have monitoring and evaluation frameworks for that, but also how the international carbon markets could be evolving in response to Glasgow. So really a depth of information there. I'd encourage everybody who's on the call, if you have any questions, we are taking questions, so I can see them filtering in. So I encourage you, if you do have them, pass them through. But at this point, I'll just start with a couple that have already come through. So one of there was a comment both in Cynthia and Francesca's presentations about that kind of interaction between when you're transitioning from an SBT target at that 90% decarbonization rate or an 80% decarbonization rate, as discussed at the agricultural level. How do you conceive the difference between what is an offset and how that can be valued within those two frameworks? How do you conceive how a supply chain linked removal can be considered versus a reduction at the agricultural level? And I don't, maybe Cynthia, if you want to give us your thoughts on that first and where you see that falling in that line, it'd be interesting to hear.
Okay, so broadly, like offsets are only fit into this beyond value chain mitigation category. So, so investments that happen in addition to reducing emissions in line with science. And so offsets sit outside there, outside the value chain. Then there's the whole insetting or supply chain intervention category, where both WRI and SBTI have not fully clarified or defined how they fit into greenhouse gas accounting, how they fit into a science-based target. I fully am aware of all the challenges in making investments in the value chain when you don't have transparency in your value chain, or you only are a small customer of a supplier. And so very sympathetic to all those struggles and want to find a way for SBTI to be able to accept supply chain interventions that meet some criteria for credible accounting and verification. But we're still, over the next year, we're doing a broad Scope 3 project where we're doing a broad rethink of how we what target setting methods we enable, and maybe doing it Scope 3 category by category, and thinking through our Scope 3 criteria, target validation criteria. So I expect as part of this process, we'll come out with more definitive position on the inset side. But there's still, opportunities, of course, for emission reductions within the value chain. When they're traceable, you can get primary data. There's no question about whether they're allowed or not. It's just a matter of when there's this lack of transparency, what do you do?
Fantastic. And maybe Francesca, if you want to comment on, amidst that uncertainty, how are you working with companies to support them through this investment mindset and what they can achieve?
Yeah, usually when we discuss this with corporates who are just exploring that space and trying to define their strategy, I mean, we stick to the rules. So we usually say we cannot be certain, right? So we clearly set expectations that there might be changes in the rules. And hence, what we're trying to do is model different scenarios, right? So usually, if we see roadmaps, as Alexander also pointed a little bit at, there is a long-term vision and a short-term vision. In the short-term vision, we have more certainty. We also usually know what are the reduction interventions we can do in the short term. There is anyway question marks for the long-term vision. There might not be the technologies there yet, and there is not the clear picture of how to scale that whole piece. So there is uncertainty anyway, and we try to, I mean, as with any risk and any uncertainty, we try to lay out the different type of possible outcomes of the rules. What would it mean? What are the implications? And in general, what it comes at in the end is, I mean, you invest in both. The best advice I can give is you get active right away in both, in reductions and removals as much as you can, because that in reductions can never be wrong, right? And a lot, then it's also about the claims and some off-farm investments. Of course, they only count as offsets, and you could only claim them for compensations. But from a point of investment and from decarbonizing, we also want to foster that, right? And there's community benefits and other things which companies value, and that's why they do it. So it's not only the accounting perspective. And yeah, so I guess we need to deal with the uncertainty.
Fantastic. No, I think that's very much the right answer. And the thing that we all don't want to see is any slowness of the momentum. I think we all agree collectively that momentum is what we require in this space. So I think that's a very fair answer. Coming back to actually a comment, Cynthia, that you made about the ability to measure and have traceability and have detailed information, and I may throw it to you, Naomi, but a question that came from the audience is, aren't all of these activities heavily dependent on the ability to accurately measure cocoa-related emissions? If so, what is the status of the capability to measure emissions, to understand connectivity to a supply chain? And Naomi, I'll start with you, but obviously it's open to everyone thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two sides to that question. One is the ability to measure emissions within cocoa activities themselves, because that relates to, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, depending on where you're at in the supply chain. And then the second is related to, the accounting of emission reductions, which might be happening from project level activities or jurisdictional level activities, in terms of reducing emissions or increasing sequestration. There are, on that side, the latter side, in terms of reducing emissions, a number of methodologies and approaches that have been approved, whether that's under the VCS or other carbon standards, to be able to do that. There's a lot happening in the space in terms of building on the lessons of the last 10 years and the latest innovations in science and technology to improve on the ability to accurately estimate that. I can't speak as much to the ability to measure the footprint themselves. But I think, likewise, there's a lot happening in terms of improving on traceability, improving on being able to estimate the emissions that come from the activities throughout the supply chain. I think the challenges are really around, traceability and then linking those two. And so a lot of the work that we're doing around the scope 3 side is looking at the ability to potentially shift from one thing to another. So, you're a company, that some of your supply comes from this particular place, but you don't know exactly what farm. For example, you might start with an emission reduction project or a sequestration project that is in the same region generally, but working on, for example, reforestation or restoration or agroforestry or things like that. once we have better traceability and accounting estimates of the footprint and can actually link down to the farm level, if that activity is within the supply chain, you may then be able to shift it across from an offset to an inset or inside the supply chain. So we're sort of looking at what's the realm of the possible there, and as we get more and more sophisticated tools for both traceability and the assessment of the emissions in the supply chain itself. But I think others on the panel might be able to say more about the accounting of the footprint side.
Does anybody in particular want to delve into that topic as well?
I mean, I can take or say something. I would agree to Naomi. However, full traceability, it's the ideal and it's a long way. So that is also a little bit the challenge, Cynthia, with the latest wool work and the WRI strict interpretation of insets and offsets. It would mean on-farm activities, if only on-farm and really direct supply chain activities add to your, or you can account for your SPT, that requires full traceability, basically. And that's the challenge. That's the biggest challenge I see in terms of project activities and interventions. On the general question of accounting and footprinting, yes, indeed. I mean, the better the footprint, the more detailed the footprint, the better the work afterwards. And primary data is, again, the biggest issue. But there, I think Alexander pointed at, it's a journey and it's a constant improvement journey. So with Nestle, for example, we did start at a rather higher level with the first corporate footprint and use a lot of sector-based averages or sector and country-based averages in terms of emission factors. And then we focus down on certain hotspots, realizing maybe cocoa is one of the major contributor to the footprint. Okay, so let's go into the cocoa sector and let's go more into farm level. And then let's use some sample farms to improve the footprint. And then the next year, add more sample farms and so on. So it's a continuous improvement. However, it also requires that the stakeholders in a sector collaborate, because that should be shared knowledge. And there are initiatives where we do improve on an emission factor and uploaded it to the LCA food database and so on. And that's needed more in order to improve the accounting at the whole sector level and share knowledge.
Fantastic. And maybe, Alexander, you're in the situation of a lot of people listening to this call where you've made a decision as Nestle to go forward, to be ambitious, not just on individual initiatives, but globally on your goals for Forest Positive. When you hear and understand the challenges of uncertainty, that we're growing our understanding on accounting principles, on monitoring evaluation protocols, the specific use of different types of interventions in your ultimate goals, what were some of the key barriers or some of the key decisions that you all had to make as Nestle that help you get over that barrier to make those investments?
Yeah, it's this uncertainty, of course, when you discuss this within the business. So everyone is thrilled to talk about carbon zero or net zero and says, yes, that's the right direction. But then, of course, when I talk with my business colleagues, when I talk with the market, they, of course, say, yeah, but when can I have the benefit? When can I touch it? How can I talk with the brands? How can we allocate to a certain brand or to a certain geography? And then can we allocate? Yeah? Does it count in SBTI or not? And it's a lot of things. And then, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a specialist anyhow. I'm lost, in some of the topics. So in all honesty, it is complex. I always thought that finance and business is complex, but I feel this is much more complex. And it's really all of these details there, which make the discussions internally sometimes frustrating also for the teams. Yeah, because they want to support. They say, yes, let's do Cavalli, but who gets it? Can we then, if we can count it, can be allocated to a certain brand in a certain country? How long? Yeah, what can we say? How can we be sure that we are not being hammered down because of greenwashing then or whatever? So and this may sound very basic, but this is let's say the daily challenge. But next to that, also in terms of making projects happen like Cavalli, it sounds easy, yeah, but already doing the logistics with the people, bringing them into the forest, yeah, transporting them, having availability of people to really engage locally, yeah, because it's not that people are waiting then saying, thanks that you come, I always wanted to do reforestation. No, because it's their forest. Road conditions then, even if you have convinced people, if the communities agree and if they see benefit, then if you have horrible weather conditions, there are no roads, so you can have thousands of seedlings, but you don't bring them where you need to get. Yeah, so this we had underestimated, for example, when we started Cavalli. We thought this would be much easier, but we've learned. Yeah, and so lots of challenges, but yeah, as I said before, and Anne also said, it's a journey. I would say we get every day better. We don't get every day more clarity, maybe every second day, and then sometimes we do a step back, but we're on the right direction.
Fantastic, and I might jump in with a comment to close this piece of it. And there's a fantastic question for Charlotte that I want to get to, but discussing the uncertainty, I know, can always be intimidating for companies looking to go down this path. But I think we've heard simply on this call the number of key milestones that we'll be facing over the next year in terms of de-risking the available use of these projects for carbon commitments is quite significant. I mean, all of us on this call and everybody in the room, I'm sure, have gone through the journey over the last 3 years of learning about the SBTs, evolving understandings, and trying to devise their own strategies as to how do we fit within what is a complex, as you say, Alexander, framework that is incredibly important, but we have to be patient because of the complexity. The pieces need to come. And with the evolution of the net zero initiative, there was a lot of optimism about the additional use of removals associated with supply chain interventions. With the new announcements on the percentage of which removals can be used in basic terms against net zero, there's a bit of hesitation and trepidation. And then there's a lot of opportunity associated with, the flag resources that will be coming out, the updates to the GHG protocol, further definitions on the use of voluntary carbons after the Article 6 negotiations. And obviously, Naomi, as you said, as we kind of digest that information over the next year. So while there's a high level, there's a certain level of uncertainty that, Francesca, I really hear, we have to address, be honest with, and collectively negotiate together. Over the next year, I have a lot of excitement, and I think a lot of our partners have a lot of excitement over the key milestones that we'll be seeing over the next 12, 18 months, and how that will help to de-risk the investments that all of us are collectively making in the field through supply chain linked intervention. So on that point, I'm really excited. And from what I hear from you, Cynthia, from everybody, from Naomi. Now, on another firming point, Charlotte, we have a great question for you, which is, where should companies be focusing their resources today from a risk perspective when it comes to government and engaging with government? Should they be focused on site scale RED initiatives, jurisdictional approaches, or negotiating directly with governments on sharing emission reduction outcomes between supply chains and NDCs? Which options would be less complicated for immediate action to reap and to support, substantial claims on carbon, in your opinion?
Well, I think first, let's focus on the realities and what the what the corporates can do, and not, let's not have it driven all by accounting challenges, because at the end we need to address climate change, and we need to be transparent about what can be done, what can be measured, and what cannot be done and not be measured. But this should not go into our way of action. I'm a bit worried sometimes, and also when I read now what's coming out of Glasgow, that it's all about, look at Article 6, it's all about the accounting, rather than what we really need is a discussion on the investment incentives. And then, the accounting should follow. Unfortunately, in the climate negotiations often the other way around, which worries me. And we need to keep in mind, that the governments have a lot at their hands, looking at what is being expected from governments that often have, limited institutional capacities to implement Article 6 compared to what they had to do with the CDM. It is significantly more, and it will take years and years, to achieve. So what I'm saying is, what I want to say, is the corporate should not they should not overwhelm the governments. They should not expect to get corresponding adjustments, in 2022, or even to have the governments figure out what the strategy really is. They are only starting. So what I think is, it is more a discussion about what to do in terms of implementation. This is what I can do in the supply chain. This is the forest risk assessment that I can do. These are the data that I can share. And then, once that is transparent, then opens a dialogue later on to see how to divide the emission, reductions, or how to claim them, or how to communicate them. But I would first, have a discussions on how can we help to achieve the NDC, and what is our role, and what is the role of the government, rather than complicating it too much. As somebody who spends a lot of time trying to explain governments how different things works, and I know, we have used, we needed years to get letter of approvals for the CDM, which was an easy thing compared to today. We just need to be careful and not overwhelm, what is already overwhelming for big corporates, with whole sectors focusing on this, and groups that, and many people that try to figure this out. Let's not overwhelm, government capacities now.
Perfect. And then so just to note, we have 5 minutes left for everyone, and this is a bit of a jump ball. But I'd be curious, we have a question on, how do we manage future scenarios in which, there's the possibility of apples to oranges comparisons between NDCs and corporate commitments, et cetera, similar to what you're saying, Charlotte. I'd be interested if, just as a kind of a closing, if each one of you could share, what do you see as a key step that we have to all be considering in the industry? What is a key measure that should be a focal area over the next 3 to 5 years to make sure that we get to that point of having consolidated understandings, apples to apples comparisons of initiatives, and key accounting frameworks aligned? I'd be interested, maybe Naomi, if you want to start with what would be one key initiative, one key focal area that you'd really like to see more work on?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question. I mean, in my mind, I think we have to be really careful not to be seeking the perfect accounting system that separates everything. And what I mean by that is, as you all know, one company's scope 1 and 2 emissions overlap with another company's scope 3, overlaps with another company's 1 and 2, overlaps all of those with national accounting, overlaps with what's happening in terms of emission reduction projects. And I think if we're trying to seek perfect clarity over all of those different separations in accounting, we'll create a system that's absolutely impossible to implement. And what's much more important is that everyone takes responsibility for their own emissions, including scopes 1, 2, and 3, and seeks to reduce them as much as possible. And that's the part that we are focused on accounting and reporting and having transparency about. And so I think it's really critical that we do that, along with improvements in the types of claims that can then be made on the back of efforts that are being taken, whether it's by corporates, whether it's by projects, whether it's by countries, and what they've achieved and what they can claim transparently. So I think I mentioned earlier the work that the VCMI will be doing in the coming year. At least it's the expectation. I hope it plays out the way that a lot of people are hoping, which is that they really work on providing some consistent guidance on what it means to use units that have or don't have a corresponding adjustment. In other words, whether or not there's any potential, not double counting, because there isn't, but double claiming that might be happening at different levels. And what can be said about those, what can be said in relation to the science-based targets or net zero claims. A lot of companies use a lot of different words, and I think there's a lot of confusion that results then about what corporates are actually implementing and what it means in terms of the overall climate solution, especially vis-a-vis what countries are doing. So I think if we can clarify that we can drive transparency around what the units have and what they do. At the end of the day, a ton is a ton of carbon, and that's the important part. And we need everyone to be doing everything that they can to reduce emissions, rather than seeking this perfect separation of accounting across every potential overlap. Because if we do that, it will be impossible.
Fantastic. And with just 2 minutes left, first of all, I'm going to thank everyone for the amazing session. I think that was an amazing discussion, really fruitful for me personally, I'm sure for everybody who's listening onto the call. But I am happy to hand it off in that last 90 seconds that we have. If anybody in particular wants to make a similar claim as to what they think we really need to be focusing, Francesca, Cynthia, Alexander, Charlotte, happy to have you jump in.
I could jump in quickly. I mean, I think I just concur with what we just heard from some what Charlotte said. I mean, I don't think that I'm not so worried about double counting. It's all about the claim that companies want to make with their investments. And if they just want to say, I'm making a contribution to accelerating the transition by investing in the carbon markets, then it doesn't matter if they're double counting with countries. And I totally agree that perfect accounting is not the goal here. And we need to get companies focusing more on investing their resources and taking action rather investing their resources on accounting. Hopefully, technology will get us some of the solutions we need over time to create the accuracy and transparency we need in value chains. But in the meantime, companies should just be taking action and be very transparent about what they're doing. And we need to just provide more clarity about insets, because I think these supply chain interventions are gonna, in the interim, before the perfect accounting, are gonna be essential for companies to meet their Scope 3 targets. So don't wanna discourage companies from making those kinds of investments.
Fantastic.
If
And
I
with
can
that,
jump in here. No, but I really, as a company, I really understand it. I think the most important is, let's do the right things. Yeah, that must be priority. And then of course we ask, from a company point of view, we ask let's say the carbon accountant specialist to find the right way to get it accounted for, but also to have clarity on the claims. Yeah, because as I agree, which was said before, there are too many claims out there, too many misleading claims, which already creates a mistrust among the consumers, and this is the wrong direction.
Fantastic. And I'm not quite sure, but I have a feeling that we have been transitioned. They've transitioned to the other session. Is that correct? I believe so. I think perfect. Are we still live, or are we finished? I'll take that as finished.
Finished.
Perfect. Wonderful. I mean, honestly, that was